And it was late Friday afternoon, and Dad looked around and realized his son wasn't there. And he called his son real quickly, and he says, "Where are you? Where are you? We need you down here at the store." And his son says, "It's Shabbat. It's the Sabbath. We have to be home preparing for Sabbath. I can't be down working at the store. You know how strict my wife is about these things." And his father says, "I told you there'd be nothing but trouble." Within the Jewish community, it's not uncommon to have differences of opinion. There are the Reconstructionist Jews on the most liberal end of things that really don't pay much attention to the biblical laws at all. And then there are the Orthodox, even hyper-Orthodox at the other end, who want to make sure that every little law is obeyed perfectly. And the same is pretty much true in Christianity. We don't have quite the same extremes on the biblical laws, but we are concerned about which of the laws we're supposed to obey, which we're not, how thoroughly are we supposed to do it. I can remember serving a little church in rural Ohio and having one of my parishioners come to me for pastoral counseling. She was very, very concerned about her daughter. She had found out that her daughter was crocheting on Sunday. She wanted to know if that was okay in the eyes of the Lord. Things have changed over the years. I can remember in Washington State when I was young that the butcher's counters, the meat counters at the stores were not operational on Sunday. Some thought that had to do with Old Testament law. I thought it had to do with the strength of the butchers' union. But there were blue laws, and there were stores and businesses that could be open and others that couldn't, things that needed to close certain hours of the day. And that's changed now. You can do almost anything, almost any time of the day, and pay no attention to the Sabbath law. But as much as we laugh, we chuckle, we remember those days when the meat counters were closed on Sunday, we still continue to ask ourselves, what is the will of God? How does it apply to us? What is God's desire for us? And how do we help to fulfill that desire? Amen. Some of us can remember way back when Sandy Koufax, perhaps the best pitcher in the National League, a Jew, refused to pitch at the World Series because it was the Sabbath day. Unheard of. There are those who take their faith so seriously that they risk their professional reputation. What is the Sabbath? Do we adhere to it or not? The Sabbath, I would say, is sacred. Sacred because it's God's will for our well-being. It's a gift given as a blessing to us. A gift given as a blessing to us. Who can tell me, biblically speaking, why we have a Sabbath? Why the seventh day? The Reverend Pastor Steve Babers here, he must have an answer to that. Herman's been teaching adult Sunday school classes for how many years?
I don't know.
Why do we have the Sabbath?
Creation story.
What's that?
Creation story.
The creation story.
Amen. That's right. That's what I started.
God created for 6 days and then went fishing. Out of Homer. To catch halibut. My sister's at Homer right now.
I said
Creation story.
We needed rest.
We needed rest. If God needed rest, we needed rest too. We're made in the image of God. What makes us think we can get by with less than God needs? Very, very good, Leonard. So we have creation story, the seventh day. We needed rest. We have a gift to us. Paul?
And also deliverance from Egypt is another reason.
Holy moly. You know, you get enough pastors together in one room, you start covering all the reasons. Why the deliverance from Egypt? What's that got to do?
Remember.
One thing we don't often think about is there are two stories of the Ten Commandments, one from Exodus and one from Deuteronomy. And the one in Deuteronomy adds something that isn't in the one from Exodus. If you want to know the difference between the two, I posted it on a board. You can look at them after the service. Do this remembering that God brought you up out of Egypt. Any other reasons why we would have the Sabbath day? It's sacred. It's sacred because God needed to rest and knows we need to rest too. It's sacred because God gave it as a gift so that we can restore ourselves, rejuvenate ourselves. It's sacred because God brought us out of slavery. And what do slaves not get? Slaves don't get a day off. It's a remembrance that there is oppression in the world that can make us slaves. Economic slaves, physical slaves, whatever it might be.
Right.
And that God leads us to freedom from slavery.
Good.
There are some gifts that aren't much gifts at all. Candace and I are taking care of not one but 2 dogs this week. Our sons are off with their birth father in Hawaii, and their dogs are at the Woodworth Newman compound in Belgium. Big deal! What's the big deal about taking care of a couple dogs? Well, the dogs have special dietary needs, so you need to make sure that they get the right food and they don't eat the right food. And the dogs don't particularly like each other, so you can't take 2 dogs for a walk at once. You take one dog for a walk and then you take the other one for a walk. I remember when I was a kid, one of my kids in school got the most wonderful birthday gift you can imagine. He got a puppy. Wouldn't it be neat to get a puppy for your birthday? And his parents were upset. What parent wouldn't want their kid to have a puppy? A parent who's had to take care of 2 dogs that don't get along with each other and have special dietary needs. There are gifts that are given for your enjoyment that become a burden. Become a burden. They aren't a gift at all. They're a torment. And that's what happened to the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is given by God as a way of allowing us to recharge our batteries, to be renewed. The Sabbath was given to us to remember we aren't slaves. We are free human beings made in the image of God, able to set our own agenda. The Sabbath was given to us so that we could just have a day to savor and enjoy what we had created during those 6 other days of the week.
Amen.
But there were some folks, there's always somebody that isn't satisfied with somebody else being happy. And so they turned the Sabbath from a gift into a burden to be borne. In Israel, I've mentioned to you that when we were in Israel, the hotels have Sabbath elevators. Because of the strict understanding of Sabbath, you're not allowed to push the button to tell the elevator to go up. So if you're on the 6th floor, how do you get up? They have an elevator that runs on the Sabbath all day long, stopping at every floor. So you get onto the elevator and you stop at the 2nd floor, and the 3rd floor, and the 4th floor, and the 5th floor, and the 6th floor, and then you can get off. There are people who started parsing the rules about what you could do and what you couldn't do, and made it so that life that would be acceptable in the eyes of those judgmental people became unbearable in the experience of others. And so along comes Jesus. And Jesus comes to set us free. Jesus comes to set us free. Jesus comes to set us free not only from the oppression of tyrants like Caesar or Herod. Jesus comes to set us free from the tyranny of misguided religion. And so Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field, and some of the disciples decide to pick some of the grain and rub it behind the hands to get the husk off. Those of you who might have grown up in grain country, farm country, know what I'm talking about. I've gotten the husk off the grain. I've popped the wheat in my mouth. I've chewed it and enjoyed its flavor. It tastes kind of like bread dough a little bit. But those who aren't happy letting other people be happy said, "Oh, Jesus, your followers are breaking the law." Jesus reminded the Pharisees, the law was given for our benefit. It was given as a blessing. God didn't create us so that God would have somebody to relax on the seventh day. God didn't need that. God created the seventh day because God knew that we needed it. And God is about meeting the needs of God's children. It's interesting that that story is followed immediately by this story of Jesus healing a person in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Man comes in who has a withered up hand. Have any of you ever seen somebody who had a withered up hand? Candace and I knew a little boy named Emmanuel in the Congo who was born without complete hands and without any feet. And this man with a withered up hand came to the synagogue on Sunday and came to the synagogue on Saturday, the Sabbath. And what was wrong with that? Does anyone know what was wrong with that? Deformed people are unclean. It's questionable whether he should have been allowed in the door or not. Must have been a progressive synagogue. And he comes in and he's got this withered up hand, and Jesus tells him to stretch out his hand, and it isn't withered up anymore. And they're ready to go for Jesus, and Jesus says, God's priority is taking care of the needs of people, not making people take care of the needs of some set of rules and laws that have been invented. So what did they do? I find this very interesting. The Pharisees and the followers of Herod started getting together to plot about how to take care of Jesus. You don't understand what that is because you didn't grow up in first century Jewish culture. What he's saying is the alt-right and the radical left got together. Jesus unifies the world sometimes just by making everybody equally angry. They got together and started planning how to destroy Jesus. There are those in our world, when you allow love and compassion to make your decisions, who will plot about how to discredit you and shame you and blame you. There are those who will say, if you care compassionately for the person who's violating our standards of behavior, our standards of productivity, our standards of whatever it might be, there are those who will attack you and try to discredit you. In those moments, I want you to remember that the Sabbath is sacred and is a sign of God's love for humanity. It is sacred coming out of the furthest past of our memory. It is sacred coming out of the creation when God needed to rest. It is sacred coming out of our daily lives, those times and those places when we have been enslaved, when God has come to lead us to a promised land. But there's a third way I want you to remember the Sabbath, not only from the ancient history, the beginning of time when God rested, not only from the current human experience when we are liberated from slavery, whether it's to mental illness or whether it's to chemical dependency or whether it's to social pressure and judgment. There is a third way I want you to remember the sacredness of the Sabbath. Rabbi Abram Heschel once said, at the time when God was giving the law to Israel, God said to them, "My children, If you accept the Torah, the law, and observe my commandments, I will give you for all eternity a thing most precious that I now have in my possession. And what, asked Israel, is the precious thing that you'll give us if we obey your law? It is the future, said God. It is the world to come. Show us the world to come. Show us an example of what the world to come, what heaven will be like. And the Lord said, the Sabbath is an example of what the world will be like. The Sabbath is given to us, a time of rest without the obligation of labor, so that we can see and experience the promise that God has for our eternity. The Sabbath is a gift for God given to us, allowing us to experience what God has in store for our eternity. The real Sabbath is a momentary glimpse of the kingdom of God. Another gift that we have of God's kingdom is the gift of communion, the table at which all are welcome and all will receive. And so as we, on this Sabbath day, enjoy the gift of rest, let us come to the table of God, equals with one another, free from the bondage that the world has to offer, and grateful for the gospel that Jesus gave us, that God's gifts are given for our good,